On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
Because I have to let go of sort of this template, which includes relationships and people who may be the same people, but I'm not the same person. I have to make choices about how I show up in certain spaces where I may not be accepted. Oftentimes by people who look like me. And where I'm no longer accepted, perhaps because I don't fit the description of what people thought I was. And that's hard.
Patrice Funderburg is the founder of Educate to Engage, a consulting firm specializing in transformative change through education, exposure, and engagement. The firm offers strategic planning, organizational development, training, and facilitation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Previously, Patrice had a 20-year career in corporate human resource operations, including for Belk Incorporated and Lowe's companies. She is a member of the Leading on Opportunity Council Addressing Economic Mobility, the Center for Community Transitions, and the Women's Impact Fund. In this episode, we explore transitioning from corporate work to social activism, race consciousness, and a journey of self-care and liberation. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Patrice, welcome.
Thank you.
You have been an executive working in human resources for large corporations for most of your career. Mm-hmm. You recently left corporate life to pursue a cause that is personal to you. What is that cause?
I left corporate life in early 2016, and I set out on a quest to find my fit in social justice. Attending community meetings and just getting better acquainted with folks that I knew in the community and different things that were happening in the community. And I quickly discovered that my pursuit for finding my fit was really a pursuit of finding myself outside of sort of the brands and the borders of the corporate spaces that I had spent the majority of my career and really my life. I set out to explore what that meant, and I kind of enjoyed the freedom in just allowing myself permission to explore and rediscover who is Patrice outside of insert company name here. And that really changed the direction and the course of how I viewed my existence and how I viewed what was important and where I wanted to anchor myself to doing work in this sort of next phase, this next season of my life.
And what did you discover was important to you?
I discovered a lot of things. I discovered that seeing humanness was more important outside the borders of the corporate buildings that I worked in. I discovered that justice was important. I discovered that I had sort of some reactions to what was happening in our country that was really personal for me as it relates to people that are close to me that were impacted by the justice system. And I found both sort of an academic interest, but then an embodied interest in exploring and researching and discovering and learning more and getting closer to work around policing and incarceration. And so I think in giving myself permission to find myself, I found my fit in social justice work, specifically around justice reform and incarceration.
Why is incarceration and justice system reform personal to you?
I think I'm still on a journey discovering that. However, when I got involved in 2016, it very specifically was a personal reaction to watching Philando Castile being killed live on Facebook. The night before, I had watched the evening news and watched Alton Sterling being killed by law enforcement in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And I woke up the next morning and saw the Philando Castile video and was just paralyzed. I'm a runner and decided to hit the Greenway to clear my head and loosen up my body and kind of figure out what I needed to do and just release. And I ended up having what I believe was an anxiety attack while I was on my run. When I got myself together halfway through my run, I felt a sense of peace and calm and quiet surround me on the Greenway in a very, very profound way. And because I had been on this journey, right, of giving myself permission to feel, I sat in that. And it was surreal. And I get emotional even thinking about it now. It just catapulted me into you have to do something. And I didn't know what that was. And I believe that it was a spirit moment that put me into the space that I'm in today.
That moment led you to found an organization called Educate to Engage.
Yes.
What is Educate to Engage?
So Educate to Engage is a consultancy that I started, and I work with people and people in organizations on transformational change through education, exposure, and engagement.
How do you go about your work?
So the work actually started as what's easily defined as a book club. I started with a community book discussion on Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And what I decided to do that day after my run was break the book down into digestible pieces, chapter by chapter. And so it ended up becoming a 6-week book study. And I was learning about activism. I was learning about movement work. I was learning more about justice and the justice system and the history of the justice system and ways that I could incorporate material into the sessions. And it turned into this thing. At the end of 2016, I decided that I was ready to continue sort of further exploring what was this next step for me in terms of all of my years working in corporate human resources. And so I formalized the organization as an LLC in early 2017 and began focusing on the consultant practice. And so aligning the strategy and vision and mission of organizations with transformational change practices.
Patrice, there is a particular petition and campaign that you are leading, directed at one of Charlotte's leading institutions. What is that petition and campaign?
Mm-hmm. The campaign is called Rename Keith Family YMCA. And as a Y member and most recently group fitness instructor at the Y, I became aware that the University City branch, when it was renamed in spring of 2017 from University City to Keith Family branch, I learned that the Keith family, the local family, has ties to the prison industry, up to and including the county jail here in Charlotte, prison contracts, a term in the space we call prison profiteering. And the work that I'm doing, obviously, in justice reform and advocacy for people directly impacted by incarceration was a pretty profound conflict in the values that I live by in my work. And I actually kind of felt it in my body, sort of this reaction that I'm really intentional about thinking and feeling with my whole self in ways that I haven't done in my prior life for whatever reason. And so when I learned that the Keith family, this name that's on the Y that I've been a member of the majority of the time, the years that we've been in Charlotte, the same Y that my daughter played sports in and where I loved teaching my kickboxing class, had chosen to name itself after a family that is making money off of contracts that cage humans. And I could get into all the statistics and things, but even here locally in the county jail where there's significant over-index of people of color in the county jail, and here's a local family that makes money off of that, it just didn't and doesn't sit well with me. And so I started the campaign, which is now up to almost close to 20,000 signatures. And it represents a real opportunity for bold leadership from the Y. If we say in Charlotte that we're serious about systemic change and closing the gap on economic mobility.
You've had conversations with officials at the Y about this issue?
We have had some email exchange back and forth, but there hasn't been any direct communication as of yet.
What do you hope happens?
I hope they rename the Y. That is the ultimate goal.
Patrice, you are an upper middle class former corporate executive. You had this moment of spiritual awakening. You now describe yourself as an activist. What does the word activist mean to you?
In the context of my transformation, my personal transformation, my transition from corporate to activism, I would define activism as showing up for a particular cause, doing the work of learning about that cause, understanding where the gaps are, knowing how your gifts and talents can contribute to closing that gap, and then physically showing up to do that work.
Patrice, how has this transition been for you from your former corporate life to this work of activism?
It's been quite a challenge navigating into a space that is unknown from a space that I was very comfortable in since high school. Here in Charlotte, the nuances of letting go of a part of my life that sort of really illuminated as my life the entire time that I've been in Charlotte to pursue something that I have such a personal commitment to in ways that I'm still trying to define is hard. Because I have to let go of sort of this template, which includes relationships and people who may be the same people, but I'm not the same person. I have to make choices about how I show up in certain spaces where I may not be accepted. Oftentimes by people who look like me. And where I'm no longer accepted, perhaps because I don't fit the description of what people thought I was. And that's hard. I try to be very unapologetic. I allow myself to feel what I feel because it's the truth. And my faith and my running and my Christian rap music that I listen to as my church keep me grounded in navigating this new way forward for me. The other thing is that my family gets to witness this. And there are no words to describe that piece of it. So it is really hard. It is really hard, but it is where I want to be. It's who I am becoming. It allows me to show up and embody the work that I have to give and the offering that I have to give as clients, as a consultant. And it gives me the freedom to be whoever the hell I need to be in my community dialogue series, to maybe give folks who participate from wherever they are participating from some glimmer of, I can peel off something to see somebody. And I'm willing to do that, but it's hard as hell.
Do you think a person needs to personally experience racism or injustice to fight for equity and justice?
No. What I think anyone who's fighting for race and equity should have a clear understanding of race consciousness. I think anyone fighting for race and equity should have a fairly keen sense of race consciousness as a grounding principle, practice, value in how they fight for race and equity and justice. Race is a construct that sort of layers how things are structured in our country. That's just the reality. And without having a consciousness of that, we could be very well intended from wherever we sit, but the impact is going to be felt differently because of these race categories that we operate under. And so having a layer of consciousness to what that means in the fight for equity and justice has to be considered if we are going to have equitable outcomes. I see people as human, and I see people based on how I see people, white, black, and any combination in between. Having that consciousness allows me in my work to consider, not decide, but consider all of the implications that come with race as a foundation for how we move in this country. And I don't think you have to experience racism to be in the movement to fight for equity and justice. I think you just need to have a good, keen grounding of race consciousness in order to move and operate in ways that move us forward.
Do you want a world in which we are post-racial?
I want the world that we live in to honor and celebrate all the ways in which we are different. You know, what's funny when I hear you ask that question? So I grew up in Buffalo and right on the Canadian border, and we used to go to Toronto a lot. My dad played tennis and we used to go to Toronto a lot. And I was so fascinated by people in Toronto. Part of my family is West Indian, and there's a lot of West Indians in Toronto, and there's a lot of Asian people. And I mean, it just physically looking at people as a kid before I knew or even cared about all these different categories. And I used to just love looking at people and figuring out in my head, like, what is that person's background and where are they from? And I really think that a lot of that drove me into the work that I ended up doing in the corporate space and human resources. And so I want that, I want that back, like how I used to really get excited about seeing different people just exist in Toronto. And I think I miss Toronto too.
Do you think people in Toronto operate with race consciousness?
In today's world, yeah. I don't think anyone cannot.
So you think race consciousness is necessary for us to have this kind of world that you want?
Absolutely. I think race consciousness is essential for us to reimagine a new world. And race consciousness in ways that almost force and demand us to think differently about the templates that we operate under today. Race consciousness in ways that force us to cultivate and further explore what does that mean in terms of traditions and the arts and how that shows up and how that can inform other things like governance and policy. And it's exciting to think about the convergence of all of that and traditions and cultures having a role and playing a role in how we move and operate in the world. Having a race consciousness, I think just for me, it allows me to just be whole, right? From the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. I'm, learning about practices and customs in different religions without all the legalism, but then also movement and sound and words and from other cultures that have been stripped, right? Because of colonization, and allowing myself to feel what that feels. And even the expression of color and touch in the senses that is not it certainly was not a part of my corporate life. And so there's a liberation in that. And for me, since I've transitioned out, a lot of those experiences for me weren't new, but I had been so well trained to not feel. And it feels good to feel that now. And a lot of that, I think, comes from this grounding of not just race consciousness, but what that means, right? Everything that comes with that, traditions, cultures, engaging the senses and how you show up in the world and showing up in spaces unashamed and unapologetically about what you can contribute. Because I have academic background and professional experience and all these things, it really informs how I can give to the movement and give to my work and give to other humans that are trying to figure this out in what their space and place is and how can they craft what they want to do in the work as well. And that's a really good feeling to have that sort of personal liberation and then sit back and think about that came from this space of race and race consciousness and what that means outside of the narrative of quote unquote race and race consciousness.
Patrice, you are on the Leading on Opportunity Council.
Yes.
Addressing economic mobility in Charlotte. What are your thoughts about the work of the council?
So the council was a recommendation made by the Opportunity Task Force to serve as sort of this convening body and building of an infrastructure to address the issues defined in the task force report. And so the council is made up of public, private, and community at large folks that meet on a regular basis to begin to develop what that infrastructure looks like. What's important about the Leading on Opportunity Council is that our focus is building the infrastructure, so that foundation that really gets at the root of systemic change. And systemic transformational change is not something that is going to happen in 6 months, a year. This is, as we say, decades long work. And the council is really intentional about creating the types of partnerships that may have been started but haven't really been cultivated across public, private, and community to really address systemic change.
Are there questions you are asking yourself about your role on the council?
As a community at large member on the council, I oftentimes find myself thinking about being seen and heard. And what does it mean to no longer be seen as a corporate human resources professional? And what does it mean to be seen or not as a community activist?
Patrice, I'd like to talk about your life and how you came to this moment. You grew up in Buffalo. How would you describe your childhood?
I did grow up in Buffalo, and I had a great childhood. My parents are not originally from Buffalo, and so we traveled a lot. I traveled to New York City a lot to visit my grandparents, and I traveled to Charleston, South Carolina a lot to visit family. I grew up Catholic, And so it's kind of interesting looking back. I was that kid that wore a uniform from first grade to 12th grade, and we were pretty active, my older brother and I, before my younger siblings came along. And I had a pretty good childhood.
Your parents were professionals.
They were. Retired now. How they ended up in Buffalo, my dad was accepted to law school at the State University of New York at Buffalo after they graduated college, and he became a lawyer. And my mom attended grad school at the State University of New York at Buffalo, and she was a public school teacher and retired as a public school principal in Buffalo.
What was the conversation around your dinner table growing up?
Well, my parents, I don't know that my brother and I had too much to to contribute. My parents talked politics all day, every day. I've got my hand slapped more than once trying to change the channel of the TV at 6 o'clock and 6:30 for the nightly news. But they talked often about national politics and then politics in the city. My dad especially was very heavily active in a lot of county work. He worked for the state, and so he traveled downstate to New York City a lot. Was involved in the corporate community in Buffalo as well. So they talked a lot about what was happening in our city and the ways in which both their roles sort of intersected with what was going on in Buffalo.
You went to a private school from K through 12, including an all-girls Catholic high school.
Yes.
How did that shape you?
Well, I didn't have to do a lot of shopping. I think attending Catholic school was really interesting. Elementary and middle school and junior high, for me, really was about sort of memorizing religion. I think it was very legalistic. And when I got to high school, being in an all-girls environment was in and of itself unique. But then also, I didn't have obviously any experiences of distraction, boys in the halls and that sort of thing. What's important is the church that I attended in K to 8 was in a bilingual community. And so the church that I attended was also the school where my brother and I attended, and it was a predominantly Black and Latino school and community. My high school was predominantly white. And going to high school was sort of when I really realized the difference between the community where I grew up in elementary school and the community where I was riding the train to go to high school. And I don't know if I paid attention or if I cared or if there was really a huge impact in the moment. But looking back, I realized that did have an impact on how I viewed the world at the time and even how I view the world today, because I had those two lived experiences. And I think my parents were intentional about that. Now that I think about it, I think I have a broader view of the world because of those experiences. And it helped me be more critically reflective of the ways in which I operate. And I wonder sometimes if my transition now is affording me an opportunity to really think back to those days in high school, which groomed me for my corporate experience, but not so much for the activism that I do now. And what does that mean? And I don't know the answer to that question, but my everyday existence now, where it's sort of I'm giving myself permission in this sort of liberated state to explore what that means, because that is important to me.
When you hear the word privilege, how do you react?
When I hear the word privilege, I roll my eyes. When I hear the word privilege, I think about, here's another word that we use to separate people into certain categories of dominant and subordinate. When I hear the word privilege, I think we need to stop co-opting words and redefining them to fit all of the discord that's going on in our world. When I hear the word privilege here in Charlotte, I get annoyed because people get defensive. That shuts down the opportunity to really unpack what that means. When I hear the word privilege, I get annoyed because people assume that privilege is something that is attainable. So I roll my eyes when I hear the word privilege. I'm over it.
Is it a word you use?
It is, because I'm an actor in all of this, just like everyone else. Sometimes it's survival. Other times it's to make a point. The language that I use, particularly in the community engagement, the dialogue series, we do unpack it. It's a word that I use, I think, because it's just a part of the narrative that has to be disrupted. And I'm just as guilty as everyone else in using it.
Are you privileged?
Hell yeah, I'm privileged. I grew up with a certain amount of privilege. I show up with privilege. And I have privilege. If I'm defining privilege the way that society is defining privilege.
And the way that you use it.
And the way that I use it.
Who did you want to be when you were young?
I always wanted to be, I wanted to be the chief diversity officer of a Fortune 20 company. That literally was a statement that I wrote when I was in a minority internship program in high school. I had a close family member who was like an auntie, and she was an executive with Sears, and she wore nylons and heels and business suits, nice tailored business suits. And she got her hair done and did all the things that I wanted to be her. And when I started to participating in internship programs and things in high school and had an internship in a corporate office and learned more about sort of, at that time, I think it was like EEO and fairness programs, and I think it was before inclusion was added on, but it was diversity. I wanted to be that. I wanted to be the person on the inside of a corporate office so that I could wear the business suits and the heels and the nylons and things. But I wanted to do the work that ensured more people like me had that same opportunity. And so when this chief diversity officer or CDO role started to emerge in the corporate space, that was who I wanted to be when I started my career.
You became the person you wanted to be.
In many ways, I did. I'm proud of that.
You went to North Carolina Central University.
Yes.
For business administration.
Yes.
What do you remember about those days?
I remember arriving to North Carolina Central in August of 91 and telling my parents, leave, I'm here, be gone. It's time for me to be an adult and whatever that means, but bye. I remember arriving and being on campus at Central and just being surrounded by Black people and Black people from everywhere and super smart Black people and Black people who really didn't want to be there. And it was heaven. I remember going to Central, felt like heaven. I remember being on campus, going to class and having that sort of independence of waking up on my own and going to classes and meeting up with friends and hanging out and staying out late and participating in clubs and organizations on campus. And it was all Black people talking about things that Black people talk about being Black, and bringing all of our experiences from all ends of the country. I got teased a lot because I wasn't from New York City, but that's okay. I really loved attending North Carolina Central. Eagle Pride.
Do you want that experience again in your life?
I'm creating that experience again in my life. It just happens to include a landscape that isn't a Black college campus. I think my life experience has shown me that I can have that experience of a Black college within my community. And it doesn't even exclusively have to be just with Black people. I love people. When I was at a Black college, I didn't only interface with Black people. In this stage in my life where I'm remembering and rediscovering and celebrating and honoring all that I was then that made me viable candidate for the corporate positions that I've had, and how I can be that whole person again in my community and for my community. So it feels pretty good to be in a space where I can create what that looks like for myself.
Patrice, most of your career has been corporate HR with a focus on diversity and inclusion. What did you enjoy about that work?
I loved operationalizing diversity and inclusion work, particularly in retail, because a lot of it is very finite. I really enjoyed learning the business and then translating what that means from the lens of diversity and inclusion, how to achieve bottom line business results when we talk about diversity and inclusion. And I was fortunate to be a part of developing what those models look like for pretty large companies. And I'm really proud of that work. And I'm proud of the relationships that I made with people who I didn't otherwise think I would make those relationships with in the context of that work. So I think I'm really proud of helping to be a part of laying foundation for thinking differently or thinking operationally about diversity and inclusion in large corporate environments, and leaving a legacy for other individuals in the organization to carry that work forward, that in many cases allowed them to bring their whole selves into the work and still achieve bottom line business results.
There came a time when you left your corporate executive work and self-care became important to you. What does self-care mean to you?
Self-care to me is Zumba. Self-care to me is going for a long run on Sunday morning and listening to my Christian rap music while everyone else is in church. Self-care to me is meditating. Self-care to me is honoring my body and my mind in ways that allow me to be whole. Self-care is managing my finances in a very different way today than when I was working in corporate. Managing my self-care is being aware and noticing and giving myself permission to cry if I feel away or be angry if I feel away. Self-care is Patrice giving Patrice permission to be Patrice in a very holistic way. Patrice doesn't have to be only academic, only professional, only this. Patrice is all of these things and more. And self-care is a word that I can anchor to in any one of these areas: spirit, mind, or body, movement, dance, color, all these things that liberate me to be a whole human being. That's self-care.
Where are you right now in your journey?
I am at a place where I've learned a lot in the last 2 years. I'm at a place where I feel really good about what I've learned. I'm at a place where I feel very convicted about the work that I'm doing. And I'm at a place where I am incredibly unapologetic about the work that I'm doing. I'm at a place where I'm navigating truth in different spaces. And what does that mean? I'm at a place where I'm really enjoying life and all that life can be when I liberate myself. I'm at a place where I'm in really good company with some really phenomenal people. my immediate family and my chosen family and my new family, my tribe, my girls. I'm happy.
Thank you for your time today, Patrice.
Thank you for having me.
Patrice Funderburg is the founder of Educate to Engage, a consulting firm specializing in transformative change through education, exposure, and engagement. She attended North Carolina Central University before earning a bachelor's degree in human resource management from the State University of New York in Buffalo, and a master's degree in organizational communication and development from Canisius College in Buffalo. And now, a personal word. I am so moved by Patrice, moved by the honesty of her feelings, by her strength and vulnerability, by her call to higher ground. Patrice could have continued to live a life of upper middle class security. She could have gotten the next corporate job. She could have represented her company at community meetings. But she chose the harder work of social activism, the harder work of being more than position and wealth, because other things now matter more. When she told her story of going on a run, with news weighing on her of yet another black body dying at the hands of law enforcement, and how it led her in that moment to confront who she wanted to be and what life she wanted to live, I could see the memory of it come over her. A spirit had moved through her. It had embodied within her. I thought of her story as her own conversion on the road to Damascus. I thought also of the words of Viktor Frankl, author of Man's Search for Meaning, a defining book of the moral philosophy I hold true, that we determine ourselves whether we give in to conditions or stand up to them, that we always decide what our existence will be, that the next moment is ours to make, and that every person has the freedom to change at any instant. Every situation we encounter is ripe with meaning. Existence confronts us with choice. The decisions we make determine who we are. In 1948, Jean-Paul Sartre, in his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, made this case. We live in anguish because there is no way we have to live. We choose who we are. Even deciding not to decide is a choice. We create ourselves every moment in what we do and do not do. In saying this, Sartre said we are condemned to be free. Condemned because every choice has a price. Even the best, most desirable choice provokes some degree of regret, since every choice confronts us with what has been lost as a result of having made the choice. Choice is not always a pleasant experience. It can be quite overwhelming creating who we are, but we cannot escape it. There is no exit from creating ourselves. In our freedom and responsibility is the anguish of the human condition, and also its wonder. It is these feelings that I sense from Patrice: grief, hope, freedom, uncertainty, conviction, pride, an identity being created, a new person in formation. Patrice talks about self-care and liberation. She is talking about herself as one person, but not only herself. Self-care and liberation is social equity and justice. It is the same work. Self-care and liberation is being kind to yourself, forgiving yourself, believing in yourself. So social equity and justice is being kind to others, forgiving others, believing in others. As we create ourselves, so we create community. This is what Patrice is doing. All of us have this choice. We can listen for the call. We can stand up and decide. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning, Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.